Hello and welcome everybody to this very special session. I'm Karthike and it is my pleasure to moderate this session. So the topic for today's discussion is the credibility in question of India-US relations and their soft power conundrums. It is a pleasure to host this session and a distinguished panel joins us, and I would like to first introduce them. I'm joined by Mr. Akshop, who is a visiting fellow at the Observer Research Foundation. He is joining us from DC. Then we have Rishabh, who is a faculty of international relations at Nasi Munji, Mumbai. And finally, we have Avivardhan, the president of Global Law Assembly. So, as far as Indo-US bilateral relations are concerned, they have developed quite a bit. And the development was carried on from Manmohan Singh to Mr. Modi, and it has become a considerable global strategic partnership. However, despite the growing ties, we usually hear that there is some trust deficit within the Indian side, and so this trust deficit questions the very credibility of this relationship. And so we would like to discuss about that. So without any further delay, I would like to pose my first question to the panelists. And so it is said that there are four key pillars of US Indo-US bilateral relationship, and these issues are defense and security. Second is trade and economy. Third is India and US support in the international organizations and at the international level. And the fourth is the shared values. So I think this answer would serve a good primer to the fundamentals of Indo-US relationship. So I would like to begin with this question, and the panelists are free to, whoever wants to go first can start.
You can go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, if I can get the ball rolling, if Abhivardhan and Rishabh are okay, and then I can love to hear the. So I think Karthik, at the outset, look, there's fundamentally what we have to understand. You kind of laid out some of the primers of the pillars rather, and I think there's another pillar that's important. You mentioned defense and security, you mentioned trade, you mentioned shared values and where India and the US are in the world. But the fifth thing is also the global diaspora, the Indian diaspora in the United States, because it's come from the archaic notion of what we saw in the 70s, call it the fakirs or nails, the snake charmer stereotypes, of what it was to where it is now within the Indian diaspora and the highest echelons of the private sector and the public sector, with a vice president of half Indian origin, and you've got Microsoft and Google CEOs of Indian origin, but also like the ubiquity of the Dr. Patel or the spelling bee champion. So that has also had a fundamental importance. But the shared values has always been a very, very important concern, because Washingtonian notion of what's important has always been democracy and democratic values. And you know that when India and the United States do meet, it's always this belief that it's the world's oldest democracy and the world's largest democracy. Fundamentally, that shift happened. We're talking about a good 30-year story, because 1991 was seminal for a few reasons. One is we're talking about the collapse of the Soviet Union, which sort of shed off any perception of India being in the Soviet camp, because while India was always fundamentally non-aligned, the ties under Nixon and Indira Gandhi really were very strenuous, because that's sort of where India and US relations hit, and now there. But in 1991, few things happened. One is obviously Soviet Union collapse. India opened up its economy. So we're talking about liberalization, privatization, globalization, and we're in the 30-year anniversary of that. But there's also the fundamental thing I like to take you back when Narasimha Rao visited the United States. And it's very funny to when Modi visited the United States recently with Howdy Modi in Houston, because when Rao visited Houston as well, there are a few things that was in the backdrop. There was a Kashmir insurgency, as well as right now Kashmir is 370 there. But Rao and Clinton sort of spoke about new India-US relations, and where a new India was opening up. And what I'd like to say is that that fundamentally in the last 3 decades, India and US relations are truly bipartisan. Because if you think about it, we are at every permutation combination of Congress, BJP, Democrat, Republican. Just very quickly, since at least Vajpayee, Clinton, you had Democrat, BJP, you had Vajpayee, Bush, that's a BJP Republican, you had Bush, Manmohan, that's Republican Congress, Manmohan Obama, Congress Democrat. Then you had Modi Obama, Democrat BJP, Modi Trump, Republican BJP, and now back again Democrat and BJP. So it's the strategic partnership is very, very broad and very intense, right? The defense and security is well established because as you see a belligerent bellicose China, the role of the Indo-Pacific gets important, the role of India and Quad gets important. It's almost inversely proportional. The Quad's relevance will be getting more as long as China is more hostile there. I would say to close my opening point, I'd say that look, for a lot of times, traditionally Republicans have looked at India as a democratic counterweight to China because, as you said, the shared values of democracy, the fact that India is a large burgeoning market for U.S. goods and products. There's nowhere else to find such a market of a billion plus. The only other market is China, which we know is considered a Washington antagonist. But the fact that the belief was that as India rises, that this will be democratic counterpart to China. However, the Washingtonian consensus among some of Indian diplomats is that India can't be a democratic counterweight to China because China is 5 times the size of India's economy, and the sense of India's strategic autonomy is very strong, where India doesn't want to be used as a geopolitical pawn. So, but just fundamentally, I'll just close it there on my opening notes, and happy to hear Rishabh and Abhivardhan and get in as the conversation is continuing.
Yeah.
So if Rishabh wants to go ahead after.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, thank you, Abhivardhan, for inviting me, and very good evening or good afternoon, wherever, good morning, wherever you are all joining from. I agree with most of the things Akshobh has said. First of all, I think if you look at, we kind of understand, or we know, for example, that on the defense and security front, India-US relationship, has thrived. There has been changes in multiple administrations over the years, but the fact remains that we've built on that relationship, and I think we will keep on consolidating because of the convergence of threat perception that we have in Asia, right? So ultimately, the main goal is to basically balance China, and in that sense, I would say that that a lot of these things that we're talking about the credibility issues, they will remain, but they will just probably be episodic, in my opinion, because ultimately I think the main point here is balancing China, right? And I think especially over the last 2 years, I think in terms of what's happened with India and China, I think that has kind of dawned upon Indians as well. But I do see that there are some issues, right, which are not just issues with which have spawned in the last few years. For example, we have had issues with the United States on trade, for example, right? There has been something. I mean, if you look at, for example, the coming COP26, for example, I think you'll see some minor differences, emerge there as well. There has been issues of forced localization practices, etc., which US keeps invoking. We also have some issues on the trade front. But I think overall, in general, I do agree that despite these issues that that we're talking about right now, the general trend of the relationship is mostly positive. And I think, again, as we can talk about shared values as much as we can, but ultimately the thrust of the relationship basically comes from the strategic necessity that we have, or a strategic imperative that we have, which is basically a growing and a more assertive, shall we say, even more aggressive China in Asia. Not just, not just in Asia, I would say, but, in their global interactions in general. So, yeah, I would agree, but I would say that there is an important, I think, for a better US-India relationship, I don't think that we should be ignoring some of these minor differences, because they have the potential to become small thorns, I would say, not hurdles, but small thorns or small irritants in the relationship, right? So I think by focusing on them, by talking them out, by meting them out privately or etc., I think that would be a better approach, because I think in the last few years, because there has been so much of euphoria in the relationship, right, in the bilateral relationship, rightly so. But I think, on that front, we need to be, more focused and solve some of these issues, especially, I would say, on the trade front. For example, the GSP issue, for example, which the Biden administration said that, this is our priority, this is something which we'll work on, this is something which will restore. I think those kind of small things can be done, which will, give us a better sense of what are the, things that that we can work on in the future as well. Yeah.
Great. So I actually wish to know about the views of all the panelists, and then I thought, let's jump in. So I see it from more of a realpolitik view, and I see it because of the simple reason that we all know about that. Okay, fine. When it comes to climate, when it comes to defense, when it comes to shared values, India and US have convergences, and these convergences have been developing since the liberalization times in a more effective manner. We have seen that there's a bipartisan consensus, as Akshov rightly pointed out, and as the Quad has emerged, I can very confidently say that even there's a bipartisan, I would say, interest. I don't know consensus. I think there will be consensus very shortly. Interest in the Quad from all the bipartisan contingents of India. I'm not talking about Democrats and Republicans. They already have agreed on the Quad. I'm talking about the Indian political parties. That being said, one thing which is would be important for India-US relations as we move this discussion forward, as Karthikeya would ask further questions, I think we need to see the two things which are associated with India, which are key tools of the realpolitik. First is the development of this global order. Now we know that scholars call this global order kind of a multipolar global order. Some a minority of scholars call it a US centric global order because of the soft power empire of the US and its influence, and also the relationships it has with European and certain Asian countries. That is why the shift from Asia Pacific to Indo Pacific has been very important. And since that shift has already happened, but of course, in terms of businesses and all of that, that transition is still underway because the technocratic legal understanding and all of those things need to be passed on. It will be a long term process. That's why I remember Dhruva Jaishankar giving a very interesting statement on Quad. I don't remember, maybe he tweeted it some time back or somehow. He stated, I think, that the Quad is more like an entity. It's like an entity like those of the First World War times or something like that. Of course, not like alliances, wherein okay, fine, we are partners to each other, and since we are partners to each other, we are believing in a few things, and we need to gradually develop this has to churn out. So I see it from that perspective. I think it's pretty going fine at an institutional level also, when it comes to cooperation between the leaders, the institutions, whether it is the India-US Business Council, or whether any other subsidiary institution within the Indian government or the Parliament of India, and vice versa for the US institutions. In that sense, I think the development is gradual. It's going to be very incremental. What we need to see is that energy security and the focus on disruptive technologies, because these two things will matter a lot along with climate change. How will they shape India-US ties? So I think in the realpolitik, as we are competing with China, China is somebody who needs to be, according to some people, quote unquote, replaced by somebody who is actually not just a believer in liberal democracy, but also somebody who believes in the rules-based international order. Fortunately and very interestingly, we see that India in the various international organizations from the UN to wherever has actually contributed to the rules-based international order in a much neutral and in a much reasonable way. Like we remember India chairing UNSC meetings when it comes to the Korean War. India has also participated during, I believe, India has also very interestingly voted when the battle between NATO forces and, if I remember, Muammar Gaddafi was happening, and at that time, India had also voted in favor of the US move of humanitarian intervention. In fact, India's approaches to it have been quite balanced. Of course, reconciliating, but they have been transitioning with time. So I think as we discuss further, we'll see these developments, and I would be happy to talk about them.
So, were quite interesting points raised by many to the panelists. But I have a follow up. As I mentioned, one of the pillars of the cooperation is cooperation on international level. So, as Rishabh pointed out, the trade disputes which we have, like India's stand on services and agriculture, and U.S. imposition of tariffs on Indian steel, etc. And there's always a problem there's always a dispute at the WTO between India and the US. And considering the pandemic, like this was being discussed that uh, since a long time the West has allowed you know too much dependence on China on their supply chains, and it was being discussed that post pandemic world the countries in the Western Europe and in the Western world will try to, bifurcate the supply chains from China to another country and not just dependent on one country. So if we are having trade disputes and stuff like that, we have so much, disputes regarding, market access and trade. How do you think that this bifurcation or shifting of supply chain is possible in the Indo-US tie? That will be one. Second would be the issue on climate change. This also pertains to international cooperation, because this was being discussed that after Biden administration would be more tough on India regarding carbon emission, etc. And I think there's a meeting in Glasgow this year, at the end of this year, regarding climate change. And do you think that the new administration will be quite tough on India, despite the fact that India has been one of the major economies that has actually complied with the Paris Agreement? So I would like to hear your views on these two basic points.
Yeah, look, trade is one aspect where countries can spar and still be fundamentally the strategic partnership or alliance, whatever you want to call it, won't be altered. Don't forget, US and Canada have taken each other to WTO many, many times, and one would argue that bonhomie is one of the best, fundamentally, within the lexicon the two neighbors could have. So with India and US, look, you can still argue over soybeans and buy submarines. That's the way I'd like to put it as well. You already highlighted some of the issues. Don't forget that India is the US's ninth largest trading partner. The trade as of 2019 and 2020 was close to 160, $170 billion. The goal is to grow it as much as $500 billion, and that would sort of tie in as India kind of inches to a $3 trillion mark and has aspirational goals of getting to $5 trillion economy. That trade would automatically grow. The United States had recorded initially under the Trump administration close to a $23 billion trade deficit with India, which is something that it didn't want. And of course, you mentioned about India was hit hard by the President Trump's aluminum and steel tariffs, and then New Delhi also slapped back tariffs on 20 to 30 US products, including Harley Davidson motorbikes and Apples as well from the United States. And Washington, of course, which really hurt India, was withdrawing a long-standing preferential status in GSP, and that was around 2019. And India, of course, was precluded from exemptions of billions of dollars worth of US tax and levies. Of course, don't forget that there were supposed to be meetings at that time with Robert Lighthizer and Piyush Goyal. That did happen when President Trump came to India for the reverse Howdy Modi, the Namaste Trump thing. Look, but that was the Trump administration. Trump was, of course, trade and tirade, as I like to call it, right? I mean, he called India the tariff king, and but that's fundamentally always a problem that India's had, in terms of the fact that, no matter what administration you've seen, there's always been this notion that India has far too many bureaucratic limbos. It's far too hurdlesome. It's not as seamless as it is for American corporations to enter the market. But that's an India problem as of now. I don't think it affects the India-US conundrum. Of course, the trade has to grow. There are small issues that can be ironed out. But as far as a sense of, the fact that the shared values, the fact that defense and strategic partnership is strong, the diaspora conundrum, the diaspora equation is stronger as well. Trade is the one issue that you're allowed to have. It's almost like, because each country will be protective of its own trade, but without the notion of where the United States and China are in terms of this trade war, which, of course, as we know, as when two elephants fight, the grass beneath gets crushed, and you've seen other countries being more affected by this trade war. India and the United States will always have trade issues, and I wouldn't really look at that as being a dampener. Of course, revoking GSP benefits is a little more problematic, but I don't think that's something that can't be ironed out. On regards to climate change, the one India has always mentioned that, look, fundamentally, in terms of its strategic autonomy, India has always maintained certain preferences for consumptions of for things like coal and fossil fuels as well, because India has a large burgeoning population, which it won't be easy for India to go carbon neutral overnight. And I'm very cognizant I shouldn't be veering into territory, but I'm not a climate change expert. But I think those are issues that India has collectively been able to work with the United States in the past. We know President Obama and Prime Minister and Prime Minister Manmohan Singh had ironed out significant arrangements in the past COP conferences as well. And President Modi has also pledged, to work with the US counterparts on this front as well. I think these are issues that will obviously be there. It's not a seamless partnership, by no means it is. But I wouldn't. With trade, the one equation I'd always point out is that this is the one it's almost like a hall pass where two countries, no matter what the strategic partnership is, are allowed to have issues on this, and this is almost some ways can run parallel to a long term, as long as the fundamentals of a relationship are robust. The trade aspect can be sorted out because don't forget while trade in the larger context is a phenomenal aspect. What it is, what you're really hashing out are small things like we see in apples or Harley Davidson bikes or steel, which of course are large sectors, but they are small issues with regard to tariffs and certain goods and commodities. It's not nothing. No one's talking about revoking a trade relationship. So there are little benefits that you can. It's like the little negotiation element that works on. In regards to supply chains, I'll just kind of close on that point. Uh, what we saw with COVID was something that was very phenomenal, right? Because China really made itself the manufacturing capital of the world in a lot of ways. And when COVID happened, disruption in China meant disruption around the world. And most countries realized that they need to quote unquote buy what's called supply chain insurance, like because you couldn't just be overly reliant on China. And you saw even former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe had even told Japanese companies, here's $2 billion, not just manufacture in Japan, but just get out of China. That's the Toyotas and Hondas, whatever, just manufacture outside China. And this is where sort of when Prime Minister Modi came to power in 2014, the Make in India campaign was significant. Now, of course, there are issues with that as well. But what what was the overarching notion? Because India went from an agrarian economy to services, skipping the manufacturing component, right? India is still primarily an agrarian economy, and 1991 went to services. And the fact that India has a large billion plus population, semi-skilled, rural population, where things like what we call the Bimaru states could really benefit of high-end manufacturing. India still manufactures cotton, textile, jute, silk, but you want to get the Foxconn to come in. You want to get more automobiles come in. You want to see what made Taiwan the manufacturing capital of the world in semiconductors. You want that kind of technology to come in as well. And this is where India's Make in India could have really benefited more, because I don't forget, as China's purchasing power parity increases, as they move to a more consumption-led economy like what the United States has, then manufacturing vacuum will be picked up from other parts of the world. Unfortunately, India hasn't leveraged some of that the way other countries like Vietnam, Bangladesh, and Thailand have done that. It's particularly Bangladesh, right? It's still in the neighborhood. It has the fundamentals of India of a large virgin population. It was born out of a bloody war, but still has been able to leverage the manufacturing social development component with regards to this aspect better. So, it behooves in India's interest to really look at the manufacturing component as well. And I think what the Indo-Pacific, while it's publicly not an Asian NATO, supply chain is a very, very crucial part of that as well. And don't forget, you touched on trade, but modern day geopolitical advantages based on trade, supply chain, and natural resources. So, that behooves on New Delhi to really realize and leverage on these advantages. So I'll pass it on to the other panelists. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree to the point that U.S. and India have actually. I mean, recently, for example, Prime Minister Modi announced that India and U.S. will have a climate and clean energy agenda, and in that sense, I would say that both countries do agree that we need to mobilize investment in finance or scale innovative technology, etc., etc. And I think India, for its, India has actually is on track to basically meet its pledges, right? The NDCs, for example, India is actually on track in doing that. But I would say that US actually can help India and other developing countries, to have more affordable access to green finance or cleaner technology. In that sense, I think there is more room for the United States and India, and because remember, India always in these kind of forums is an advocate or in some sense leads the developing bloc of the world. So I think in that sense, India-US relationship can actually bridge that gap as well when it comes to climate. But talking about uh, the supply chain part, I think there was a lot of talk about how post the pandemic or during the pandemic, India and other Asian countries will be able to actually move away from the supply chain or actually bring, move away from China, etc., and mobilize their own industrial base. But I don't think that's actually happened. I mean, some countries have, of course, taken a lot of taken advantage of that. But Japan, for example, did try to incentivize a lot of their companies to move away from and quote unquote decouple. But I don't think India has been able to do that. I mean, if you look at our trade numbers, for example, they have grown exponentially. So in that sense, I think that's something that we need to collaborate on as well. But I think there's something that I think Quad Forum, for example, the whole Indo-Pacific thing. In the recent times, I think both countries or both governments in India and US have actually realized that this is primarily selling this as security forum is selling itself short, because there is so much more scope of actually improving or consolidating ties. For example, the cooperation on vaccine, although I would say, to be fair, I mean, till now we haven't seen much on that, but it's a good way to build on these initiatives. So yeah, in that sense, I would say that India and US, I mean, as my previous panelist pointed out, trade issues are always going to be there, right? I mean, that's not going to go away. But I would say that India and US can do more, uh, uh, because we've come or we've overcome this hesitation of history, etc., that we talked about. But I think the pace at which the cooperation is going, especially on these kind of these spheres, is a little, I would say, or has slowed down, I would say, in the last few years. But I do think that that's also partly due to the pandemic, right? So yeah, so I think on that front, on climate, I think the concerns that some in India have, that there could be a G2 because progressives will somehow in the Biden administration would focus on climate, etc., or largely focus on climate. I think that's a little unfounded. Because I think there's a lot of scope of cooperation on that front, and I don't think that will be our main focus will not be sidelined by these minor disagreements.
So, as Akshobhan Bishop rightly pointed out about trade and uh, economic engagement, I would like to point out about slight differences between the Quad framework and the Indo-Pacific, and I'll do it very briefly. And the reason is why is that, of course, that Quad is central on the idea of FYP, which was of course led by Shinzo Abe as the first place, if I'm right. I may be wrong on that, which is the free and open Indo-Pacific. One thing which is very clear to see is that, as Rishabh rightly pointed out, that India still has to incentivize a lot on the Indo-Pacific conception as well as the Quad conception. I believe even one scholar who researches on Indo-Taiwanese relations, even she pointed out to me some time back that since Indo-Pacific and Quad are something which parallelly exist at the same time and are related to each other but still are distinctive anyways, one thing which India needs to do in the case of the Quad, as of course Rishabh rightly pointed out about the fact that the vaccine initiative, which is the COVAX initiative, as per the spirit of the Quad statement, if I'm right, that has still not matured too much. It has a lot to work right now. I think we will see some developments, but I think we need to see the trajectory. So the trajectory is quite steep. So in that case, since we know that these two things are first distinctive, within that there are economic and rule of law issues, because I come from an international technology law background. So my understanding is that, okay, fine, you want to go for a technocratic order, and that was exactly what the transatlantic partnership, and also how cooperation when it comes to within Europe was also on the was also on course. So for establishing a technocratic order of that sort and having economic and climate change related issues on board, I think this is imperative for both US and India. For India, I think Akshov has very rightly pointed out the basic issues. Of course, trade will be one of the impeding issues, and this that will emerge maybe in some time as the consensus come in. I think Japan and Korea, Republic of Korea, which is South Korea, are very interesting examples when it comes to their trade relations with the US. Akshov pointed out about Vietnam also, if I'm right, or maybe Rishabh did that. So for India, I think one thing which is clear is that when it comes to rule of law, technology cooperation, or trade, what they need to do is, okay, fine, we are in board with you, we want to go ahead with it, but at the same time, we need to ensure that our strategic realities and our strategic outlook when it comes to these things are clear. Because even when it comes to investment law and other issues, Indian bureaucrats and diplomats are not clear when their approaches, and they even have very important issues which are related to law, even when it comes to companies of or governments of countries like Israel or other Middle Eastern countries. They have such disputes which actually come in. Even it happens in the WTO. So, of course, these disputes will come in, there will be disagreements, and that is fine. But I think from there, India needs to see, okay, fine, our systems need to be improved. We need to be self-reliant, as we call it, Atmanirbhar. And with Atmanirbharta, we need Saksharta, that, okay, fine, we actually cover something. And then we need to strengthen our legal and technocratic framework. When our legal and technocratic framework is strong, I think then on the part of New Delhi, I think much can be achieved in the long run. For the US, I only would like to suggest for now is that since they have charted out the path of the Indo-Pacific and the Quad, of course, defense cooperation is something which is dealt by the Indo-Pacific Command chiefly, which is, I think, I don't know if Admiral Davidson has retired or not, but I believe that is led under him only for now. So I think the defense part and Navy part is different. That is a completely different issue, maritime security. But in the soft power component and economic component and climate change component, I think that is where we need to look out how the US will shape it up. Because again, the transatlantic partnership between US and Europe, which led to the Marshall Plan and NATO very successfully, had a US interest consideration. The US had a plan about it. The US had plan for Eastern European countries like Ukraine and others. After the Cold War, they gave economic incentives. Here it's a different case. Here you need India to replace China. So when it comes to energy security and all of them, I think it would be very interesting to see how the US shapes it. I think they are doing it fine, but I think it comes on the very basic question of how they see the Indo-Pacific. So I think let's discuss further. I would be very happy to.
Well, thank you everybody for some interesting insights. Akshab pointed out, that there's a cross-partisan support for Indo-US ties, and I would like to ask my second question along the same lines. That it is usually accepted that India and US are both institutional democracies, and there is a bipartisan support for India in the US. And so, considering that, but recently we are hearing post Biden administration, it is being commented by certain commentators that allege that India's democratic credentials are deteriorating day by day. So my question is premised upon this basic point, that how that do you think it is normal in the Indo-US ties to have a regular discussion on India's democratic credentials, and whether this assessment of India's credentials every now and then is going to affect the ties in the long run? So anybody can start.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll take it up. So yeah, I mean that has been a concern, especially, and I mean, recent comments. I think, and again, I would like to be very sure, very targeted here. There have been concerns, I think, in India, and I think as much as people think that there is bipartisan support in India for the relationship as well. Let's be honest, but I would say that it's not at the same level when it comes. I mean, according to me, it's not exactly the same. I think. This administration in particular, I think, is more on board with the Indo-Pacific, or the amount of tilt, let's say, shall we say, that India needs to have or partner with Washington. When it comes to democratic values and the credentials, I mean, we do have challenges in our own polity. I think it's fair to say that we have some of the things that's been happening on an institutional level or on a political level, whether it's religious polarization or political polarization. I think some of these things are important, and as a country with a diaspora of sorts which is present everywhere, we will get a lot of these questions. But at the same time, I think India would not be, or especially I think maybe not government officials, but commentators do need to push back. I think there has been some unfair targeting of India in the recent times when it comes to whether it's called the weakest link of Quad, etc., whether it's sick man of Asia. There has been some or some of that which actually doesn't go down well with the Indian, not just the right, but I think the left as well. So I do think that in some ways if we are actually, selling this as something which is important on a shared values level as well, I think this needs to be done. This needs to be done for everybody, not just India alone. And I think in that we do see that a lot of times we see India singled out, and this is something which I don't think it will be a challenge on a long-term basis. I think these are minor irritants, and let's be fair to the Biden administration. I think they've approached this very well. That whatever the concerns they have been conveyed in a very private setting. I would say there has been no public spats, etc., or some kind of controversy. Although Indian media, etc., is always looking at some validation. This person said this, or for example, Secretary Blinken will come. I'm sure we'll see a lot of people, asking or putting him in a spot, so to say something on that front. But I think, to be fair to the Biden administration, the amount of reservation a lot of people in India had on both sides of the spectrum as to how he will approach these kind of problems. I think that administration has done it very well. But I would say that, yes, there is a problem. I would say, and this is not just an India thing. I'm not saying it as an Indian. I think that in some ways, I think this shared values thing goes only so far. And I will come to that later if I'm given the chance. I think I would like to hear what Akshab has to say.
So just before Akshab, I would like to point, like as Rishabh stated that there was a lot of skepticism regarding Biden, but the bilateral relationship has handled it quite well. And I think it was Defense Secretary Austin when he came this year in Delhi that there was a question asked about human rights issues, and he said that, yeah, we have discussed certain human rights issues. And I think if Biden has to communicate certain things, it is done in a very private, area rather than, beating around the bush and, playing to the galleries about how US is, disciplining India, etc. So I think both the president and the prime minister have managed it quite well. And I would like to hear, Akshab comment on this.
Oh, sorry, I was on mute there. No, look, I have to kind of concur with that as well. Like, look, the asymmetry of power between Washington and Delhi, and the fact that post 1945, since the Bretton Woods system, there has been this notion of Washington having, played a larger than life institution, because what the Cold War has fundamentally done is anytime when a sense of democracy or democratic values are eroded, it it behooved on Washington to play a part in it or play a consensus, right? I mean, two of Washington's biggest wars in Vietnam and Korea was based on the notion of protecting democracy. So that's not gone away. It just percolates in different forms. Now, we're not touched. We're not going to see Vietnam or Korea the same way that we saw in the 50s and the 60s. But what that means is right now the fact that you have independent senators and congressmen who are part of various caucuses and initiatives, who listen to their constituencies, who will voice and clamor various opinions. We saw Congressman Pramila Jayapal wanted to raise that when Minister Jaishankar had come to Washington on Kashmir. We've seen Ilan Omar raise various points as well. And that's fundamentally how Washington works in terms of the legislature component as well. Like you have various ministers in the Senate Foreign Relations, senators in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee who will have a voice and say in it as well. And if at all, if there are various constituencies that raise the matters, right, and then it does go to their attention and they will speak on these issues as well. Will that erode the relationship? Far from it, because don't forget, foreign policy is fundamentally set by Foggy Bottom, which is State Department, as well as Raisina Hill, South Block, and Ministry of External Affairs. So everything else, I don't want to say is a sideshow, but it may have a strain, but it won't fundamentally erode the contours of it. It won't fundamentally erode the direction of it. And we see, Rishabh touched on, we saw Secretary Austin come and make a very good visit earlier. Secretary Blinken coming down. Eric Garcetti, the mayor of Los Angeles, has been nominated to take over from Ambassador Juster as the new U.S. ambassador to India. And fundamentally, Secretary Blinken and Minister Jaishankar share a very, very convivial relationship, because Secretary Blinken himself was an old hat as well. He was part of the Obama administration. He was served as deputy secretary as well. And he's very familiar with the larger contours of the Indo-US relationship. And this is actually Secretary Blinken's first visit to one of the Quad countries, and this is fundamentally the fact that the United States has fundamentally acknowledged its larger role. And I would never want to compare India with any other country, let alone a country like Saudi Arabia. But one thing we know about Washington's foreign policy, it's Washington will look at with larger interest in the region. I mean, India is far from what Riyadh is. India is far from what any of the other countries are. But even if we just for a minute, if just entertain that thought, the United States has never really intervened in anything what Saudi Arabia has done. Forget about the fact it's a Sunni theocracy under one family. But even when under Pakistan, right, and fundamentally for many, many years during the Cold War, during Afghanistan, which is again right now back in the news, Washington looked away from what Islamabad wanted, looked away. In fact, Zia-ul Haq was the blue-eyed boy for Washington, given that he was a very, very key ally to counter Soviet forces in Afghanistan. And that happened post 9/11 when the Musharraf played the Bush administration for a fiddle. This is more of a Washington problem than anything else, yes. And this is, again, I want to caveat, I'm not saying India is going to be any of these other players, but just fundamentally goes to show that with the grand scheme of things, the United States does realize where New Delhi stands on various issues. Of course, it is more of an India problem to address concerns if they do feel that there is a quote unquote view of democracy backsliding, if at all. But I don't think that is. It won't behoove on Washington to make more noise than what it does. And of course, look, the State Department has some very smart people handling South Asia. They will give their comments and views as well. The Biden administration won't say anything publicly, and even if they do, it will just be anodyne homilies. But don't forget the independent senators and congressmen who listen to their constituencies and will raise concerns. And August 5th is coming up. That will be the second year anniversary since Article 317. There'll be some noise on it as well. But India has fundamentally always stuck to its course. India was stuck to its course when it came to its relations with Iran to avoid US sanctions. India stuck to its course when it came to Pokhran. Don't forget the sanctions in 1998 when the Vajpayee government took India publicly nuclear. India still stuck to its close relations with Russia with S-400 and talks about CASA there. So there's a lot of strategic autonomy that we don't give India enough credit for, that India will stick to its own course as well. So I don't think India tends to clamor to what Washington says as well. But of course, it is important to take note of what various constituencies and various members and various caucuses are saying. So I'll leave that there for now.
Sure. So I will be very brief on this. I agree with what Akshok and Rishabh have stated. I think value systems are something which are both top, bottom, and bottom top. It's not something which is like a technocracy, which is like, okay, fine, we'll control you and so on. It's not like that. In a real world, they are bottom top and top bottom at the same time. Now, one thing which is very interesting about the value system issue, or whether democratic backsliding or not, is that every democracy has its own particularisms. The US has it. They have the Electoral College. We have a Westminster system kind of a government with its own features like anti-defection and whatnot. The UK has its own. Israel has its own, and it's a Jewish state. Its own parliament. Not one party gets a majority. It's a multi-partisan democracy. So every democracy or any polity has its own particularisms. Like Akshay brightly pointed out about Iran, Saudi Arabia. I think with Saudi Arabia, one thing with C, and I'm just pointed out on Saudi Arabia for some very pragmatic reasons. That okay, fine. Saudi Arabia is technically, as we say, an Islamic monarchy. However, that being said, Saudi Arabia is also focusing on much liberalizing reforms for a society of their own with their own issues. And I'm not going to comment on the Saudi society much about it, but they are going for reforms and they are going for changes in their own way. So I think the US understands it pragmatically, which is, I would say, the Biden administration and even the Trump administration did. I may be wrong, but I believe they did. Both of these administrations, and to an extent, maybe the Obama administration also, but I'm not sure on that. But these two administrations were effectively clear on how value systems should be escalated. Now, these value systems can be escalated when it comes to any proper issues of policy when convergence or divergence happens. I don't think that the commentary that is made on democratic credentials, or whether the India and the US have a larger policy influence or have a larger policy consideration at all. They are moral virtue signaling things. So, fine. For example, if we remember, when international space law came into being, what happens in international law? Various countries agree on something, right? But in international space law, interestingly, it was the US that led the efforts, then the International Law Commission, then the UN caucus, and then it was agreed even by the Soviets and the Americans. We know that even the UDHR, when it came to existence, the very first, led by Eleanor Roosevelt, the widow of former President Roosevelt, we know that various value system assertions and disagreements were there. The Saudis had their own disagreements, the Soviets had their own disagreements, but they still developed the UADHR, right? So disagreements is fine. It is very natural in a real politic. And on value systems, I think this will go on only and only when there is a direct policy confrontation. I don't see that. Mostly, I see it's commentary going on for PR purposes or something like that. So in that sense, I think India and US can do a lot on value systems only and only when there's a policy consideration directly involved. Like, okay, fine, let's take an example. Let's say climate change. Climate change is an issue, and environment issues are prominent even when it comes to peninsular regions within India. Even Bangladesh has been suffering from climate change related issues. So where so in that, if in case there are economic refugees based on climate or climate refugees who are coming, then yes, there is an ethical imperative that at least they need some reasonable protection, and countries in the Indo-Pacific can support that. Like that's what happens in the case of Palestine. Countries like India, Germany, and also other countries, they fund some money, maybe in millions of dollars, to the UNRWA, which is actually for Syria and Palestine, right? So here, value system plus policy concentration, all of that germinates together. So I think let's see how this develops. I think much of it is policy commentariat, very very flashy, but not so much productive and practical. I think it's fine to have disagreements. People can have opinions and people can many things. But I think unless it has a policy consideration directly involved, I don't see it. I think we have particularized democracies. We are in a multipolar world. So representatives from various places will be different. Like Akshay pointed out the example of Pramila Jaipal, I can even point out the example of trade unions or the unionist people. So when Dr. Manmohan Singh went with the nuke deal in 2008, there were rifts in his own political party, and also there are certain opposition parties, including the CPI and so on, who had disagreement, very practically speaking, right? Still, that deal happened. We went ahead with nuclear cooperation, and we know that there are elements of democracy or some real anthropological circumstances. I think that's where I would end. But of course, if anybody wishes to add something on that, I would be happy to.
Uh, yeah, I'd just like to add something. See, for me, to an extent, I think one thing has to be clear. I think both, let's say, elders or in both countries, I think, are managing these small irritants or differences very well. I think, for at least for now, we see that all these things will not be a factor or a bigger factor than it should be. So on that thing, I think, as Akshok rightly pointed out, there are certain elements or different caucuses, different groups who are going to speak on these kind of issues regularly. I think there's not much we can do about it. I think to some extent Indians also need to grow a thick skin when it comes to that. But yes, I do think that on certain issues we need to push back as well. But not as a government response, right? But I think as Indians in general, or a part of the public discourse, some of the rhetoric that comes from the United States of shared values is also, to an extent, again, remember, it's also their own political environment, right? It's about how they are having their own debates and how they approach the world or how they see the world, right? So we have to be mindful of that as well. But I would say one thing on this whole shared value and how much there should be a focus on that. I think if to America, I think if you're seeking like a common cause in Asia, right, or in South Asia or in Southeast Asia also, if the main thing here is to impede or try to because of China's growing threat, try to balance them, then I think then de-emphasis on shared values or and prioritization of shared interest will actually probably resonate more effectively across Asia. So I think that's very important. And again, why would you want to why would you prefer a value driven strategy that risks regional opposition to counter China, right? Because again, remember, most of these countries, I mean, we only talk about India, but let's look at Philippines, for example, right? These kind of issues are also becoming a problem there for the United States. Although, again, it's been managed very well, I would say. But I do think that there are certain limitations to how much the United States should emphasize shared values. it's good to talk about it. And let's be honest, it's not just the US which does this. India as well reciprocates. I mean, Prime Minister Modi himself talks about this as well, right? About shared values and democracy. But then again, we need to probably draw a line that shared values does not mean imposition of uniform values or homogeneous values or homogeneous standards. I think India is a very different country, and we'll take our own time. And if there is a debate to be had about democratic backsliding, I think the commentariat will chime in, and I think the Indian commentariat will respond. But I think overall, I think the government, the diplomats, the strategic community, I think there is a consensus that all these things are not as important as some people would like it to be. Right? Ultimately, again, this is not about morality. This is about necessity, and that is China.
So yeah, so as I remember Pompey when he came to India in 2019, he said that great friends have bound to have disagreements, and I agree on Rishabh's what Rishabh said, that there can be no homogenization of values. It's better for a long-term partnership to find some consensus on certain issues and concentrate on a larger issue which is actually against every values we claim to stand for. And I think that should be a unifying factor. And the commentators who are unnecessarily or necessarily, according to them, are raising these issues should also see the larger picture and restrain themselves. Now, as Akshab, yeah, the important points were raised in this discussion, but I would like to just go on forward and would like to bring Trump again, because I miss him on Twitter. He has been banned, and it's Twitter is not the same anymore. No all caps, no all caps tweets. So let's go back to Trump. And I think despite a lot of issues with Trump, and as rightly many people have a problem with him leaving multilateralism and leaving organization, leaving allies, leaving friends, I would like to say that there are two positive things what Trump did, in my opinion. Now, you all can disagree with it, but these 2 points I think Trump can rightly be credited for. One was to openly call out China. Like he was, I think the US recognized China as a serious opponent, but it was Trump who rightly called out China. And second was this creation of a proper Indo-Pacific strategic construct of Quad, which can be credited to Trump, because we see a lot of mutual cooperation in Quad during his regime, and it was accelerated to a certain extent, we can say. So now this question is primarily on Quad and India's role in Quad. So a lot of people say that India's not a blue water navy yet. It will take some time. So considering that, India can very well manage the Indo-Pacific east of the Malacca Straits. Now this question is primarily what is the role of India on the western, on the the not the Indo-Pacific, the Western Pacific as area, because I don't think China is ready, India is ready to is or willing to have a strategic problem so far from the land, or the territorial sea. So this is my question: what can India do in the Western Pacific, the eastern side of Malacca Straits? Put it like that. Yeah.
When you say Western Pacific, you mean like between anything China to the United States, anything west of Japan. It's a very large water body. Look, fundamentally, I think none, uh, because it's not just capability, not defense or strategic capability. It's they want to do it. Because let's look at the fact that India, it's tied into something I've always believed in. Is India a great power, a great presence? And fundamentally, I would say great presence because um, in the Mearsheimer notion of great powers, be it the United States, erstwhile USSR, currently Russia, China, there's been a sense of spreading influence, overtly and covertly as well, right? Like we've seen with the United States, fundamentally, right from the Bretton Woods system, being getting involved in any of the world wars or Vietnam or Korea, what the United States considered sacrosanct. We saw Russia with the Eastern Bloc, or what Churchill called the Iron Curtain. We've seen China as well through the BRI, through AIB, through investments in LATAM and buying up Melbourne CBD or Djibouti port. There's been a sense of spreading its influence. One would argue India has never really done that beyond, Sri Lanka, IPKF, 71, Bangladesh, beyond its neighborhood and a couple of UN peacekeeping missions to Congo and Sierra Leone. Uh, and that's fundamentally because India has never really seen it. And why we could argue that India has this notion of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, the world is one family, maybe strategic autonomy. So it's never really going to behoove on India's interest to get involved beyond that. Even Afghanistan, the US NATO forces have been asking India to, India has been involved in Afghanistan without a single boot on the ground, through investments, through building infrastructure investments, schools, roads, hospitals. But India has never really been involved. India, even in 1996, when the Taliban came to force, India, along with Iran, Russia, and the United States, a very weird coalition, by the way, supported the Northern Alliance. But covertly, it's never been publicly involved in anything beyond its neighborhood as well. And maybe the IPKF was India's Vietnam that started, but India's strategic autonomy and its level of defense beyond a point is never really going to allow it to get involved to a large extent. And even the Indo-Pacific behooves it because it's within India's Indian Ocean territory. There's a string of pearls that China has been long pursuing, be it the port in Humban Tota, the CPEC in Pakistan, Maldives, and Myanmar and Bangladesh that have, very susceptible, vulnerable to Chinese investments. And so India is worried about its strategic autonomy. And don't forget, the two water bodies that China wants to control are the Pacific Ocean and the Indian Ocean. So that's where India sees itself getting involved in the Indo-Pacific. But even in the South China Sea, India is never really going to be a player. Like India will have military drills with Vietnam. India will help the Philippines out with some anti-ballistic ABM missiles. But India is never really going to get involved in territories that it does not need to do beyond what it calls territorial integrity. So I would candidly go with zero in the Western Pacific because it just doesn't behoove India's interest to do that. It will, value unclog. It will, India will, don't forget, Prime Minister Modi has gone to Shangri-La dialogues and spoken about Sagar, that is security and growth for all in the region, maintaining a free and open Indo-Pacific, respecting the freedom of navigation, respecting the unclaws, respecting the territorial integrity of 12 nautical miles and 200 nautical miles EEZs, countering China's notion of a 9-line, 11-line in the South China Sea. But to really get involved in territorial waters where it does not serve India's interest seems very unlikely for me.
Yeah, I would kind of agree. Although I wouldn't say it's zero, I think it's more about basically posturing. Although I have seen some commentators make or saying that India should probably chime in or do something more. But I think it would be limited to multilateral exercises. For example, Malabar was conducted in East China Sea or near East China Sea once. But I think for India, currently, when you look at, for example, how Indian armed forces have been tied down in the Himalayas, the problem that is, a potential problem vis-a-vis Afghanistan, I don't think India has the capacity, or I think even right now, the willingness to do something beyond, as you rightly said, east of Malacca. I think it would be probably limited to economic interaction in some sense, trying to build or consolidate on that look east policy, which I think has, kind of slowed down to some extent in recent times. But yeah, I would say that, it will be limited to, for example, in recent times, we've seen India and Vietnam have kind of built on their relationship on the defense side as well. But if you look at, for example, even the missiles that Akshay was talking about, the BrahMos missiles, whether it's sales to Vietnam or Philippines, I mean, if you see the pace at which these kind of things go on, I would say it's very slow, to say the least. So in that sense, I would agree that from east of Malacca, I think India has a very small role to play. I think it's just posturing, it's symbolic to some extent, but you will not, because you will not see an Indian Navy vessel going from a free, having a joint patrol in the South China Sea, etc. Because I think that will just create too many tensions for India right now. Because ultimately, remember, India, I mean, in this whole conception of Indo-Pacific, ultimately, India's role is limited to the Eastern Pacific, the Western Pacific, basically the Indian Ocean region, right? So our role primarily is to be a net security provider, etc., strengthen our relationship with these small island countries, etc., etc. So in that sense, yeah, I don't see India doing much, and I think it will be prudent for India not to as well. Not right now, at least. I think this is not the time. I mean, this is the point, right? I mean, this is for first of all, do we even have the hard power capabilities right now to even project that kind of power? I would say, I don't think so. So yeah.
So I largely agree with the panelist. I think when it comes to the Western Pacific part, which is near to the west of Japan and to the west of ASEAN peninsular countries, as we call them, I think India does not have a lot to do. However, that being said, we must remember that, and this is a normative framework question, not a practical question, of course, which I'm pointing out, or I would say it's not a question actually, it's a point from a normative point of view. So in the Quad, there's one more very important conception that has emerged, and even the four countries have agreed on it, which is ASEAN centrality. And that is something which is, from a soft power perspective, India can very well execute if it wishes to on economic and other critical technology related types. But on the hard power domain, I largely agree that it's not necessary, and I think it has a lot to do with the ASEAN countries and how they go with their own, I would say, naval options, how they develop it. The maritime exercising are going on already. So, from that angle, in the hard power domain, I don't think so. We should do it in a haste. I don't think we are interested to do that. We are focused on Myanmar, we are focused on Bangladesh, we are focused on Pakistan, we are focused on all of these countries alongside, which is perpetually called the South Asian region. But when it comes to beyond ASEAN, which is the water body region, I don't think so. In hard power, we need it. Yeah, but from a soft power perspective, when it comes to connectivity, technology, economic relations, climate, yes, therein India can have a humanitarian posturing. And then if it needs that, okay, fine. Now let's go for the hard power construct. Let's go for some maritime security considerations. Let's develop it because India can try to do it. I'm not thinking they are going to do it in the foreseeable future also. But yeah, if they wish to, then they can start with the soft power construct, which is again, it depends how much cost benefit analysis they do, how much benefits are they going to get, how much losses are they going to get if they really invest in that sense. But I think if they really wish to do, they should go from the soft power perspective, but not from a hard power perspective, definitely. So that is something which is my view.
Also, I think it was Indian Navy Admiral who said that that India is the only country that has a boundary with China in the Quad, and it will be India which will be facing a land aggression from China, the first country to face it, like among the Quad. So India has to tread very cautiously, not unnecessary. Of course, provide a net security and help the Quad in every way to contain China, but not overtly make enemies out of China that you invite an aggression in your territory. Of course, China doesn't need to be invited. They are aggressive and asserting power. So, Rishabh, do you want to say something?
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to basically make the point that, I mean, we don't have to provoke China anymore. I think they're doing. I
Exactly.
mean, there are very few things that are left that would anger China to do something to us, because they've already done a lot in the last 1 year to damage the relationship as it is. So yeah, just making that.
Yeah. So moving on to the next question, I would like to say that if we saw that India was always a reluctant country in the past, uh, eh, as far as cooperation with the Western world is concerned. But now, after 1991, and we can see that India is getting much closer to the US and major other Western powers. I think it was UK this year, they invited India in the G7 conference, and there are talks about India being a partner in the D10, and India plans to work closely with the Five Eyes. I don't think India will ever be a part of it, but of course, intel sharing is very important now. And in the Indo-French bilateral relationship have been considered in India that it's one of the best. There's hardly any trust deficit. It's a very reliable partner. So my question is premised upon this: that considering India's relationship with important players other than US, what in your opinion what is your opinion if we see a possibilities of India's rise it will be more balanced or more reliant on cooperation with the US, or more balanced with multiple allies across the world?
Yeah, I'm happy to take that, Karthika, and get the ball rolling on that. So just before that, I would like to just finish off the previous point as well when you mentioned about India having a border with China, because fundamentally, if you think about the Quad, what are the centralities, right? Apart from four democracies, it's Canberra, Tokyo, Washington, Delhi have all had problems with Beijing, right? Washington, Beijing, we can be all night, all day discussing that. India and China, the tensions have been exacerbated with Galwan and Doklam as well. Don't forget, while Japan doesn't physically share a land border with China, it has very tense maritime waters. The Senkaku Daiju Island dispute is a flashpoint in the East China Sea. Um, Canberra and Beijing is a very, very interesting geopolitical conundrum because um, what saved Australia from recession for 2008 was the fact that Beijing was buying up a lot of Australia's commodities as China was booming as well. But since the Occupy Hong Kong protests as well, China has a massive diaspora of students in Australia. And as pro-democracy students were campaigning in Brisbane, the Chinese consulate through Wolf Warrior diplomacy was looking at countering the pro-democracy protests with Australia pushed back on. Don't forget, Prime Minister Scott Morrison called for an independent investigation to the source of the virus in Wuhan, which of course angered Zhao, the spokesperson of the CCP. And China is a little bit of there is no velvet glove with the iron hand. It's just all iron hand with the Wolf Warrior diplomacy. So that's a part of the Quad that's very fundamental. It's not just a random alliance or strategic partnership. There are naval powers in the Indo-Pacific that are very important to them, but also the fact that Beijing is in the crosshairs of all these powers as well. Coming to your point as well, look, the France is a very important part as well. If you think about it, right from when President Nicolas Sarkozy was there to now with President Macron, there has been even President François Hollande in between. There's been one thing that's very central that France has become India's strongest P5 partner. Don't forget the way Pakistan has been reliant on China for its vetoes. Every time that India tried to get Masood Azhar designated as a UN proscribed terrorist, China had come forward with it. And the notion that this notion of like from Moscow, so USSR to Russia, they'll always be there. Russia has abstained on a few crucial votes, but France has been a more vocal P5 vote for India. So that partnership and bonhomie that we've seen with Macron and Modi has only grown furthermore. And I think France has also been a very stable alliance partner with Rafael jets as well. And India's defense partnership is like a good mutual fund. It's based on equipment from Russia, equipment from the US, equipment from Israel, equipment from France. Uh, Fundamentally, I would say, look, the India-US relationship has been reset since the 90s. I touched on in the beginning, from Rao to Vajpayee to Manmohan to Modi. That's only grown further and further. And it will be there as well. Don't forget, Prime Minister Modi is the first Prime Minister since Indira Gandhi to have dealt with three presidents during his term, right? And what I think is going to be there furthermore is that, look, India has the sense of India's non-alignment has more to do with sense of strategic autonomy, right? If you look at India's foreign policy, what Nehru fundamentally believed was we're not going to trade one set of Western faces, that is the British East India Company, for another set of Western faces, that's American capitalism. And one would argue that the Overton window was towards a sense of socialism. And given that India was left in a very decrepit, poverty-ridden state in 1947, and we're not even finished half of 190 years of colonial rule in India's post-independence rule as well. Uh, India will still look at a strategic autonomy that in order to avoid being part of a bipolar world. And India now looks at multipolarity. Foreign Minister Jaishankar has rightly espoused that containment, quote unquote, like the Quad, is not what containment is an archaic Cold War strategy. The Quad is future looking. In fact, a very interesting comment that just comes to mind right now is an Indian diplomat in Washington once told me that India in the Quad prevents it looking anti-China. India in BRICS prevents it from looking anti-US. But that's where India sees itself as sort of a placating force. India doesn't really see itself as, which is why India has only strategic partners and no formal allies. It's like, friends with everyone, allies with no one. It's sort of, India will look at itself as be part of the global south, part of the global north, be friends with everyone. And maybe some critics and some foreign policy strategists will have issues with this, will take umbrage with it. That's fair enough. But a lot of ways, it allows India strategic autonomy because India will fundamentally look at Israel for its defense needs and Iran for its energy needs. The fact that because Iran had sanctions on, India could get oil, which India is a large energy importer of. for its large population at cheaper prices. And India can still diversify its defense procurement with the fact that, one of the an Indian diplomat, Moscow, once said that, look, the fact that India is still reliant on MiGs, even if it's a fifth generation MiG, is because India can alter that mission and component to its strategic needs. What we've seen what happened with the MiG-21 Bison, various generation upgrades, as compared to buying from Lockheed Martin and Boeing, which comes with little more stricter protocols and assembly line functions. So, in a lot of ways, India likes to mix and match its own sets of defense and strategic ties. So, India sees no reason that it can't have good relations with both Riyadh and Tehran, with both Tehran and Tel Aviv, with both Moscow and Washington, with both Baku and Yerevan in Armenia and Azerbaijan. So that DNA of India's foreign policy is still fundamentally there to share. What's happened is that relation with Moscow hasn't gone away. It's just that the relationship with the United States has gone so much closer, and and Moscow right now is recalibrating its position, which is why Moscow and Islamabad, you see, are doing a lot more military drills and a lot more military exercises. So that's not gone away. It's just that the bonhomie with US and Washington, and of course, this is where the diaspora element is there, because the Indian dream has been the American dream for too long, right? The aspirational Indian class, the economic refugees of Indian class have always gone to the United States. So that notion has always been there with Washington, and don't forget, when this is about soft power, Hollywood, MTV, and McDonald's has taught more Indian nationals anything about the United States than any president of the or any administration has. So because of the cultural zeitgeist that the US has in the Indian imagination, and the fact that in the last 30 years that relations have grown so much closer, it seems that Moscow has been left in the backdrop. Perhaps India has to work a little harder on the Moscow relationship, but it's not really gone away. And President Putin has met everyone from Vajpayee to President Modi. He's been there for a very long time. People almost forget there was anyone before him. But the fact that that relationship is still there in the back burner, it's not completely gone away. And India still, the India's Air Force repertoire is still very much Russian led. So MiGs and Sukhoi are still going to dominate the roost. And India's highest defense procurement is from Russia, followed by Israel, and then I think it's the US and France. So so to wind up on that, I still think that India will look at a sense of balancing its priorities based on where it stands on of the near the hour, be it trade alliance or defense and security ties.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, ultimately, India. If you look at, for example, or if you hear what for External Affairs Minister Jaishankar says, this is exactly what India is aiming to do. It's basically trying to, what he calls as multi-alignment. Right? It's not necessarily non-aligned. It's just, we are trying to protect our interest in the best way we could, and that comes from successfully hedging between these kind of power centers in different regions, or in the global system between US and China, although that of course has changed recently. But yeah, I would definitely agree with that aspect. And I think to the question which Karthike asked with regards to some other partners which probably will facilitate or help India emerge as a global power, I think yes. France, for example, was very crucial in the UNSC veto or that resolution to to make that go away. More than, in fact, remember, United Kingdom. In fact, a lot of people have, in India, of course, our own colonial baggage. We have a lot of reservation in terms of how the United Kingdom looks at the world right now and how it looks at India. But I would definitely agree that the Indo-French partnership has advanced very, very fast in the last few years, and it's something which is a multifaceted relationship. But the way they look at Indo-Pacific, I think, really matches to how India sees. But just to add on that, I think ultimately what will make or what will propel India from being a global presence, as Akshop said, to a global power, or let's say a very strong counter to China, would ultimately be India itself, how it achieves its developmental goals ultimately. Remember, we've always had this soft power, hard power debate, right? In the early days, for example, it was used as a substitute to kind of shape our international environment. to the best of our advantage. It did work in some extent, but I think now, for example, we have romanticized it to such an extent that even in 20th century, for 21st century, we think that we can sustain ourselves, or even in some sense thrust ourselves in the global politics to such an extent by just posturing and projecting these values. I think that's not going to happen, and I think that myth has been shattered, especially in the last few years when we see the asymmetry between China and India grow. And I mean, suddenly people have realized that because I think in the last 5-6 years we've always talking about India catching up to China, but that's not really happening. The gap is actually widening, right? So ultimately, in some sense, I do understand some of the skepticism that comes from some commentators when they say that will India be able to sustain the accumulation or the consolidation of hard power, right? And at what pace? Because ultimately that matters as well. So this is something which I think is a variable which we ourselves have to look at. Nobody can actually help us beyond the point. And the second question I think a lot of people ask with regards to soft power, and here all these values etc. come in. Will India be able to keep up its soft power attractive enough so that when we see India's hard power falter, will it be able to still attract people, still make people be in its camp or help it out? And I would say that in that sense, it does help. So soft power does help. But I would say that this creation of this India personality on the global stage, I don't think it will buy you too much influence in today's world, how things are stacked up today. Afghanistan doesn't look at India and talks about or looks at democracy, etc. Although, of course, that's an important point. But ultimately, Afghanistan appreciates India, right? Because of its, the help that economically India has helped Afghanistan infrastructure building, etc., etc. So Afghanistan is looking to India for material help, right? And that is something which, again, is very close to how we achieve our development goal, how fast we achieve our developmental goals. So in that sense, in today's world, I would say that soft power is important, of course, no doubt. India has, I think, way more to offer just than our democratic values, I would say, which I think does not get enough attention. Somehow we think that it's just automatically there. We are a democracy. We're the largest democracy. Look at how many people vote in our election. That's it. I don't think that's how we should do it. There are multiple ways where we can capitalize on that. So in that sense, I would say in our neighborhood, and even on the global stage, I think ultimately our presence or our acceptance as a global power would ultimately stand on or is based on how we materially develop, right? And in that sense, I would say the hard power component is something which is a challenge, and I like how everybody is suddenly waking up to that reality. I mean, rhetoric will not work anymore, right? I mean, that can only go so far. So yeah.
Sure. So I agree with what Akshogan Bishop has said. I'd like to point out about non-aligned movement and multi-alignment a little bit more, and then I'll elaborate about what we can achieve here. And since Karthike questioned about whether it will be more central to India-US relations or more central to the multi-alignment fixture, as we call it, well, my understanding is that India-US relations will stabilize, they will mature, they will perpetuate in the coming years. They will, I don't think so, unless any calamitous thing happens in the diplomatic corps. I don't think so. It's going to be divergent, or it's going to be very severely affected. That being said, I think one thing which we very clearly understand is that India-US relations will be a part of the multi-alignment agenda for India. We, practically speaking, also because since India does not wish to go for an ally approach, which is the traditional multilateral approach of having alliances, and it's better not to, because multi-alignment in a multipolar order is a perfect formula for diplomacy. Why? It happens even for democracies and non-democratic countries. I mean, I can start from Singapore, which is a democracy, to UAE, which is not a democracy. So democracy or not democracy is a different question. Let's say polities. So countries like Singapore, countries like Israel, countries like South Africa, countries like New Zealand, countries like maybe in the European Union, there are certain countries like Denmark which have their own approaches. And I'm not getting into the particularisms of them right now because, of course, of the time limit, and of course, we have extended so far. But however, I have stated that one thing is for sure that what we can learn from Indo-France and Indo-Euro relations is that, okay, fine, there's a soft power component, there's a hard power component, and Rishabh rightly pointed out that the old approach of just creating a personality cult of India in that sense of how the non-line movement and Gandhian principles used to be is not going to work in the future. Very correct. At the same time, since we are waking up to the strategic reality that yes, our hard power constructs, whether at the borders, whether when it comes to navy, whether it comes to air force, is now it has to be reformed and to be put better. One thing is clear that okay, fine. Now the hard power construct has to relatively develop. It has to be stable. It has to be strong. The soft power construct, when it comes to multi-alignment, must be pursued very strategically. And why I'm saying that? Because the US kind of developed that approach when it was emerging as a country and as a superpower. It was not a superpower when it got its independence. The White House was literally burned by the Brits. And then centuries after, the US supported in many ways to Europe when it comes to World War One or World War Two, defeating Nazi Germany and the Axis powers, and then the Cold War era, wherein the United Nations was primarily led by Churchill and Roosevelt, and of course supported then by Stalin and the Republic of China and so forth. In fact, the development of France and European Economic Area was also led by the US. So once we understand this, that multi-alignment and alliance building structures, because in alliance what happens, okay, fine, you need proper political alignment, no compromise on that. You need economic alignment, no compromise on that. There will be menial compromises, but again in private. So since we know that, one thing is clear that multi-alignment is a very good tool for various countries. And also one more thing, we know that Indian startups and Indian unicorns are emerging. Indian companies are now spanning across the world, from Ola to Zomato. Let's congratulate Zomato and Omola for their achievements. So since we know that Indian actors privately also are engaging, one thing is clear that multi-alignment will help India more. I, however, see that it should not be centralized to how India and US have relations with each other. I think should be a very important part of it. Like it should be in this way, and this is my understanding that it should be proportional. So, okay, fine. You want to have more with Europe, you want to have more with ASEAN, you want to have more with West Asia or Middle East and North Africa. You can have with the US as well, and then, of course, we should go ahead of the balancing state. And since we are going there, we should focus on okay, fine. We should not obsess over the US too much. The diaspora issue is different. Of course, when we allied more using India incorporated with the US in the 1990s and the coming years, of course, many people went to the US, but many people are also going to Europe. Many people are also going for masters and other fellow programs and so on in other countries like Russia and Africa. And Africa, I'm not sure many are going, but still Europe, I can say that, yeah. So, and even ASEAN, they're going. They're collaborating in Japan, Korea, and other countries. So yes, there's a large scope. I think non-aligned movement is a thing of the past. So what we can do is that multi-alignment is something which is a better option. And since multi-alignment is there, the Indian state as well as its people can utilize their public actors as well as private actors wherever necessary. I think Indo-US will be a very important part of it, but not everything. It should be also Indo-Euro. It should be Indo-Russia. It should be Indo-ASEAN. I think that will definitely work out. Maybe we can see how India and its own and its own partners work in Africa, because Africa might be the next theater. Not very soon, but considering its economic condition and everything, I think when we focus on development economy, it will be very interesting. So I think we can vouch on that.
Just to make a small point here, I think rightly pointed out that there are multiple relationships that India needs to focus on, and I would say that I think the US relationship for now. I mean, I don't think it's a foregone conclusion that everything will be hunky dory. I'm saying that right now how things stand, I think everything. I mean, I don't think we need to worry about the relationship too much. And on the China front, I think that's a chapter, I think, which a lot of Indians, and I think even now the strategic, even some of those strategic experts or people in the strategic community who were not that convinced about how much we should rely on US have now, I think, come on somewhat a same page. I would say entirely. There's no consensus, so to say, but I would say that we have to watch out for how we handle the Russia relationship to some extent, because again, remember, I mean, I think the S-400 missile systems are going to be delivered, I think this end of this year or beginning of next year, and I think that will be an important test or an actual test. I think apart from this shared value debate, etc., I think the more important debate would be how India and United States actually traverse around that issue, because I think there have been concerns in Washington or on Capitol Hill about how much of a leeway should India get when it comes to these weapon procurement when it comes to India. So they've already given us a waiver. I think probably they will do it again. But yeah, I think those are more important challenges that we need to focus on, and I think that is being done already. So yeah, that's what I wanted to just add.
So I think India is being pragmatic in its multi-alignment. It's already it's uh, considering a space to maneuver and balance the supplies and not dependent on a single source. And I think we can all agree on that seems pragmatic for now, and in the future years it would be more clear where India is aligning. I think there are objectives and there are partners specific to that objective. So I think America, US is quite specific to the China objective, and I think that's why India is more reliant on that issue with the US. If the objective change, of course the partners will also change. So there was a very good discussion that Rishabh highlighted about the soft power thing about of India, and how hard power and soft power together will define India standing in the world, and alone soft power is not going to change a lot. And this question is actually based upon the soft power issue with India faces. Considering the India's role in the pandemic, we have seen India has been quite positive in the international relations, as far as the vaccine mastery is concerned, or revoking the partial ban on exporting generic medicines have been concerned. India has played a very humanitarian role on that. And considering that most of the liberal democracies have not been upfront about all these issues, have not, for example, the TRIPS waiver issue or US banning the export of raw materials of the vaccines, all these things considered, it seems that India, despite doing certain things on the international level, is not actually achieving a lot on the soft power front. And this might be wrong, but this is my initial assessment of this. Like, considering all these things, we don't get what our projection of soft power should be. We don't get it. And this is also a futuristic question, that uh, if we start China and India, we see that China had a problem with the rule-based world order. They had a problem since the beginning, and they seek to challenge it and even dismantle it. India, for now, despite having problem or whatever, we don't see that India is very resilient towards this international order. So, considering that and the software image, do you think in the future, if should India rise and take over US or China, do you see this might be a futuristic question there with no comprehensive or proper answer to it? But do you think that India is going to face the same hostility as China is facing due to its wolf warrior diplomacy, etc.? Because India doesn't do that. So, will India be the force for good in the future? So that's my question, considering also the software image of India.
Look, firstly, I'm still going to stick with the line that I think right now India is going to be a great presence more than a great power. I've already mentioned in terms of India's sense of not pusillanimity, but a sense of not trying to posture beyond its neighborhood. And don't forget that there are fundamentals that India has to fundamentally solve, right? That is internally as well, right? Like India's growth on the world stage as a large presence came because it opened up its economy in 1991, when it removed the Soviet love, socialist shackled economy, to one where it became an interest for Western powers in terms of investment opportunities and the economic potential that it brought. So, and don't forget, China's geopolitical heft has also come, in a sense, as post 77, the Deng Xiaoping era as well. Although the fundamental rule was Deng Xiaoping had a philosophy of hide your strength and bide your time. Xi Jinping says, all right, we're done hiding. It's only strength. Um, there are issues there because India, you see, India more and often than not will be curtailed. Like China sees India's presence as a strategic nuisance, not a strategic threat as much. So maybe not overtly, but you've seen through Stringer Pearl theory, through a Doklam, through a Ladakh, which could tie into both of China's what it sees as fundamentally Chinese territory. And we've seen that bathe through Senkaku Dayu Island in the East China Sea, the Spratlys in the Paris in the South China Sea, Ladakh, Doklam, Tibet, um, anything that China values as sacrosanct its territory, it will expand on. And India and China sees India as a strategic threat, right? And in a lot of ways, maybe Pakistan is that counterweight for India that China sees the way the United States sees India as a counterweight to China. Albeit, and there's a similarity there where both are not exactly accurate counterweights, but enough of an adversary to be a bit of a nuisance. So one would argue that there's always going to be a sense of economic curtailment, if at all, of anything. There'll always be that sense of pushback. Um, Fundamentally, India is still far from it. Right? India's one fifth of China's economy and one seventh of the United States economy. So we're still talking a good long way out. Right now, India is close to $3 trillion economy. Prime Minister Modi has ambitiously spoken about India becoming a $5 trillion economy. That may not happen in 2024, far from it, given the growth and trajectory. So that pace itself is far slow. So it's very hard to project that even a $10 trillion economy right now. And don't forget, for countries to go, a couple of things that have to happen. There has to be an astronomical rise that a country has, and the other ones do not have to grow at the kind of speed. How China was able to overtake Japan was because Japan also had a recession, and China was able to go far ahead. So that's where China. If you don't forget, in the 80s and 90s, if you look at American literature, a lot of it was spoken about Japan, the second coming, the threat to what Japan was once an adversary in World War II, and now their economic heft. Because see, in the United States imagination, right, there've been adversaries in the past, made from Imperial Britain to Nazi Germany to the USSR for 6, 7 decades to the post-war Japan. But no one has come close to dislodging the United States in the economic conquest. In China, 60% of the US economy, it owns most of the US treasury debt. There's a good line in Madam Secretary where the Chinese foreign minister is telling the Secretary of State that when China comes for you, it won't be with nukes and missiles, alluding to a Cold War strategy. It'll come to repossess you. Um, and one would argue in Washington consensus as well, it's not in Washington's interest to lose that throne or to be dislodged from the totem pole. So it's a little hard to speculate where India will be right now because, and India too, in some ways, is doing a very Deng Xiaoping thing on its own. You know, it's hiding its strength, biding its time. Um, but given what we've seen in India's own imagination, in India's own strategic conquest, it's never been in India's interest to do anything beyond that because India's overarchingness, even right now in the Israel-Palestine conflict as well, India's fundamentally always believed in a two-state solution. While India has grown its relationship with Israel since 1991, when it had formal relationships, India obviously has maintained, spoken about peaceful, peaceful settlement, peaceful solution. So there's a lot of anodyne homilies that you see coming from the Indian narrative. And let's not forget one more thing. There's a very important part that I want to tie into it before I hand over to someone else. Is um, India's foreign policy, India's foreign core, or the IFS, you have around 900 odd diplomats. Singapore and New Zealand have 900, right? And those are countries with 5 million population. Um, China has around 8,000 to 10,000. The numbers obviously, be accurate a little more, a little later, give or take 1,000. The United States has been 12,000 to 16,000, maybe 20,000. A lot of it is in 900 odd diplomats, right? And India has the numbers. India has the intellectual talent. But a lot of it is also archaic era reforms from the UPSC, right? Like the fact that the budget of the Indian Foreign Service is $2 billion, which is peanuts for, most global Fortune 500 companies have $2 billion in a quarter. But what does that mean? It's just because India has not looked at overhaul on it. India has not looked at lateral entry and promotions. India has not looked at the fact that you still have generalists who crack the UPSC, which of course is worn as a badge of honor, the way the IIT JEE exams are, the way any medical exams are. And you have journalists who come in who are suddenly dealing, and now you've seen diplomacy and foreign policy is no longer what it was in the pre-Cold War era. You're dealing with vaccine diplomacy, you're dealing with cybersecurity diplomacy, you're dealing with climate change diplomacy. You need specialists to come in. And all of a sudden, there's like, wait, hold on a minute. If you have specialists come in, how do you have, where do you do with the promotion? In India's foreign policy, it's always been like a computer code, right? You enter foreign service, spend 7 years here, get promotion, and spend 5 years here. It's like you write a line of code, it automatically functions. No other profession functions that way. Even the president of the United States cannot guarantee a 4-year term if he gets impeached, right? But it's almost like, you enter here, you spend 2 years here, spend 2 years here, you get promoted. And I mean, obviously, you may not be foreign secretary, you may not become ambassador of the United States, but you'll get to some level. If you spend 30, 35 years here, you'll achieve that seniority, you'll get your pension. Now, I'm not saying that you need fully political appointees. I mean, Pakistan has more political appointees than India does. The Pakistan ambassador to the United States has always been a political appointee. That also comes with problems, as you see in the United States, also based on political appointees. But however, I do think you need specialists. You do need someone who's a climate change specialist to deal with climate change diplomacy. Just because someone has spent a certain amount of time doesn't make a history major or economics major more qualified. I mean, when you have someone in the San Francisco consulate, you need someone who understands tech diplomacy better. Similarly, someone in the Houston consulate, you need someone to understand and deal with energy companies better. So we've had too many generalist fitting specialist positions, which is a lot of square pegs and round hole philosophy. And for India, if we're talking about India trying to achieve its sense of, in a sense of rise to this predestined position of great power competition that we expect to, there's a lot of internal reform that India has. And this is just one such reform that strikes me, because it doesn't make sense for a country so big, so vast, to only have 900 odd diplomats. And there's a lot of other positions there which we can spend a whole conference getting into. But I just wanted to put that out there and say I'm not sanguine. I'm just more realistic on where I see the India story as of now.
So just before Rishabh, I think, of course, there are major domestic issues we face, and I think New Zealand is certainly bigger than Singapore. We just have to compare ourselves with Singapore. Singapore has a larger diplomatic corps than what we have, and considering the trade issues, WTO has a very huge Chinese contingent, and we have a very small members there. And I think there are major domestic changes which we need if we want to actually project our hard or soft power worldwide. And I think on that point I will agree, and I'm pretty sure more panelists have a lot to say on that, so I'll just pass on this.
Yeah, I think I agree with Ashok that I think that's a long way out. India has to reach a place where we can speculate about what will come. But I will say that considering how historically how Western powers have seen emerging powers in Asia, I would say that we can expect some sort of pushback, although it will not be like, for example, how China has done the recent years, because I think it will also be contingent upon our own behavior and how we conduct ourselves in the world. And I think that will be very different, or not very different, but I think definitely not like what China has or the path China has chosen. Having said that, I think one of the important things that you touched upon was vaccine diplomacy, and I think this is something which India has actually, or this is I would say this is a case in point of where or how India approaches global governance or global issues, especially when it comes to matters of inequality, right? So in the cases of vaccine, for example, you see, for example, the United States now taking the initiative, sending vaccines to different countries. They have their own initiative, which is picking up pace, which has to be appreciated, of course. But then again, remember, India also did that, and even got criticized for it at home, right? The whole "Hamari bachcho ki vaccine videsh kyun bhej di," etc., etc. The Modi government actually got a lot of slack for it at home. I mean, I know I have relatives who actually asked me that question, but why did that happen? Why was it necessary, etc., etc. And it was very difficult to answer at that moment of time, right? But I would say that, and this is something External Affairs Minister Jaishankar has actually touched upon, that in a way, how India is seen in the world as being especially this government as being nationalist or etc., or a protectionist and whatnot. I would say that there are certain elements or there are certain initiatives where we've worked on. Vaccine Maitri is one of them, where you see, for example, India taking the initiative. I think climate change could possibly be the next agenda where India could actually lead from the front, help bridge the gap between the global south and the global north. Won't be that easy, of course, and would require countries like United States, for example, to cooperate and help out a little bit more. But I would say, yeah, that's something which is important. And again, this this is something which is a larger point. I think India needs to, as Akshobh rightly said, there are a lot of reforms that we need to look at. I mean, our own land reforms. You see, for example, when it comes to liberalization or deregulation of lot of sectors. You I mean, look at, for example, our problem with, we always tout our demography, right? The demographic dividend as this big selling point, the scale of our market, for example, right? But at the same time, we see that that could also be a potential challenge and a hindrance for India, right? Because if we don't see rapid industrialization or rapid creation of jobs, for example, that could actually impede India's growth, right? In some sense. So that trajectory, I think, in some sense, I'm not trying to be overly skeptical here because I know India has a lot of potential, and of course I'm banking on it to prove us otherwise. But I would say there's a long way to go for India in that respect. I think for India, and I think our policy elites, I think, realize this, that right now we are actually only trying to create a multipolar Asia, not even lead Asia. I mean, I don't think anybody in India are actually making that point that we want to actually replace China. I don't think that's possible, anyways, right? So in that sense, I think we're doing quite. We have a long way to go, but I would say that in India's own neighborhood needs more attention as of now. A lot of people in India, especially, look at, for example, what's happening with China and Pakistan, and don't want to study it further more than just pointing out, oh, there's a CPEC road, highway passing from Gilgit-Baltistan, etc., sovereignty and whatnot. I think we need to focus on what exactly is going to be the case, or how CPEC, etc., will actually affect Pakistan. Because having studied CPEC for a long time, I can tell you that despite the pitfalls, despite the dangers that China-Pakistan economic corridor faces from terrorism, etc., etc., it's actually fundamentally going to change Pakistan's economy in a lot of ways. Right? There has been a lot of progress done, and I don't think in India we have that much, commentariat paying attention to what's happening in China and Pakistan. We always look at and we always share, okay, this is going wrong, but there's also a lot of things which are going right, and that will, help Pakistan, etc., for example. And we need to look at that because in the last summer, we've had this conversation of a two-front war, or China and Pakistan colluding, etc., etc., and how India has suddenly reached out to Pakistan, there's ceasefire, etc., etc. So I think in that sense, our neighborhood right now, vis-a-vis Afghanistan, vis-a-vis, of course, the northern borders, even Bangladesh, relationships like Bangladesh and Nepal, which is going through a lot of political churn right now. I think India will be preoccupied with our immediate neighborhood right now. And I think probably so, because, rightly so, because China is actually pushing India. A lot of people, actually, commentators have actually predicted it or whatever, that a lot of what China has done in the last few years has been essentially to tie down India to its neighborhood. And although some would say that, that's something which is, India should try to, punch above its weight. I do think that it has suddenly woken up some people in India as to what exactly are we lacking in terms of our neighborhood policy, right? What are some of the challenges? So I think what China has done in the last few years, I think that has probably helped us in a way to acknowledge some of the gaps and deficits that we've had, not just in terms of military power, etc., but also economic gaps, etc. So there is a lot of room for improvement on that front, and I would say that right now our focus should be on strengthening our own developmental, or overcoming our own developmental challenges, and also, of course, seeing what's happening around us. Because I would say that in the last few years, the whole template of India-China relationship and South Asia has actually been torn up, and especially what's happening in Afghanistan. I think the whole region will be in a lot of flux. So we'll have to wait and see.
So this is a very interesting question because I've been patiently hearing on this, and much of it has to do with a loss of strategic thinking, or I would say a very predominant lack of strategic thought. For example, let's take strategic autonomy, for example, the non-aligned movement, or let's add up to that and then let's compare it with the vaccine Mathri situation and how has it gone further. I think vaccine Mathri has been a good initiative, and India has gone pretty well with that. They have got enough diplomatic capital for the coming months. And of course, When it comes to India's own approach of being a Mr. No, which it used to be, I think it's still a Mr. No. I'm not sure about it. In diplomatic terms, it is still a Mr. No. That sort of virtue signaling, which even India does at diplomatic levels, not directly or indirectly, of course, but through other means, we see that, of course, right? Now, since vaccine mastery is a great example for India to virtue signal other countries under the garb of quote unquote vaccine nationalism, that certain many developed countries, including Canada, have hoarded the vaccines or not, you know, given enough vaccines to countries. I think the one example that we get is the following: is that fine? You are going ahead with the posture of goodwill. You are going for some limited virtue signaling, but that has to be backed by your resources and so forth, your strategic thought. Now, Rishabh rightly pointed out, and Akshob also rightly pointed out about the issues related, like, for example, Akshob pointed out about the IFS. So let's go to the bureaucracy a little bit. Now we have one think tank at the policy level which deals with most issues related to cooperative federalism, competitive federalism, and so on, which is infamously replaced the Planning Commission, which is known as the Niti Aayog. They have done some exemplary work. Let's be honest on that. Uh, my perspective is mostly on technology and foreign policy, so I would much comment on that, but not here. However, I would say very humbly that Niti Aayog will not complete everything that the government of India needs. And why is that? So, as Akshay pointed out, we need specialists. I believe we might need specialists, but we need in every single ministry, wherever the ministries can, usher the challenges and come up with solutions. Now, of course, the Ministry of Cooperation under Amit Shah is a very interesting initiative. We need to see how they shape it up, because I think the Ministry of Cooperation, as it was formed, it was stated that it was more into the lines of enhancing the legal, administrative, and policy aspects of cooperation and cooperation related constitutional aspects and administrative aspects in India. So we need to see how that develops, how that comes in. The IFS issue is very, very true. We don't have enough diplomats. Let's go to the permanent mission of India, which is now led under Dr. or Mr. Tirumurti. We know that very few diplomats are there. Not many diplomats represent India in New York. China has nearly 12 or more divisions, and each division might have a lot of diplomats, which is something which is very factual. So, one thing is for sure, okay, fine, you got vaccine mastery, you had domestic issues, you got your criticism, your fair share of criticism wherever necessary. And since that's the case, one thing which India needs to focus is that it needs to have a strategic outlook which is backed by its resources. Now, one fortunate fact is that it's not that India has a deficit in everything. There are certain aspects where India has no deficits or India has a surplus advantage, like the demographics. We have the youngest population as of now in this decade of 2020 to 2030 or 2019 to 2030, as anyone would like to point it out accordingly. We have enough population in the youth when it comes to knowledge economy and information economy. So those people will go out of India, be a part of other service or manufacturing sectors, or we will be doing in the service sector. Since we have been a mixed economy in that sense that service sector has been dominant, I believe we should very much focus on manufacturing sectors. Whatever manufacturing sector aspects could come in, whether it is technology, whether it is anything. And since that is the case, we should embrace that without having a strategic outlook based on anthropological realities always leads to these issues, wherein India fizzles out in virtue signaling. I believe policy confrontations when it comes to value systems must only happen when it is necessary. That is and very enough for any country which is emerging and still has not become a middle income economy. I'm not sure if India is a middle income economy yet. Its per capita income is not so much. So from that perspective, we need to see. And I think education is also related to it, even in rule of law and constitutionalism. I think there are vocal needs to reform the administrative structure. We need specialists, but I don't think we should need them like special appointees like the US. I think we can have him in a much consultative role, but of a with much bargaining power or bargaining authority. And through that, I think the bureaucrats can channelize it. I don't think the bureaucrats are completely incompetent. Yes, there are some incompetent people in the IFS, the IAS, and so on, but not everyone. So I think in that sense, we need a strategic outlook. And if we go for specialists, let's have it for all ministries. Let's see how it develops. Let's see how it ushers. Let's see how the new cabinet does it. And as it develops, I think we can see how it proceeds. I think there's a lot to do in that.
Just to add small point, I think I know we are running out of time, but like on vaccine Maitri, for example, I think India. I mean, a lot of people when India stopped the exports, right? Because of course our own second wave, etc. etc. A lot of people were questioning post we stopped that we put an embargo. A lot of people asked us as to what happens to all the goodwill that we have created, or the supposed goodwill that we have created in the neighborhood. I don't, I, and they framed it in a very negative way, and I don't think that's fair, because even if India has stopped, what it was doing, or at least slowed the pace at which it was going in terms of providing vaccines, I mean, I don't think the Bhutanese people, for example, are going to forget the 500,000 vaccines that we've sent, right? It's not like that. That will not contribute to the soft power of India, or the goodwill that it has, or it wants to generate, right? So in that sense, yeah, we can do a lot more, but hey, so can others, right? And in that sense, what, for example, look at African countries, right? Who's speaking for them? Nobody. I mean, that's what I think, that's where foreign secretary. Sorry, I keep referring to him as that, but External Affairs Minister, actually, Jaishankar, he made that point, that on that front, the globalists have to do a lot more. You see, for example, the vaccine coverage that is there in African countries, and I mean, it's abysmal, right? And I think this is where, for example, the Quad has to back up the talk, right? We've seen all these great initiatives. Okay, Quad will have a vaccine initiative. All these countries will pool in resources. But yeah, where are you going to fill that gap which China is trying to fill? See, we can all complain and talk about how China has done this blunder, the Himalayan blunder, and the wolf oil diplomacy can backfire. But there are a lot of gaps that they are filling in Southeast Asia, not just through vaccines, because I know that there's some doubts there. But I think that America, India, and other countries, even Europe, has a lot of things where they can actually come in and help. The not just the global south, but the developing economies in general, which will create and go a long way. And I think the Biden administration realizes that, and that's why I think in the recent months, especially in recent weeks, we've seen that they've accelerated the whole the vaccine initiative that they've had. And one more thing that they need to focus on is the whole TRIPS waiver. I mean, we saw, I think, a month ago or so that they are going to, they're in support of the TRIPS waiver. But again, here you'd want the diplomatic heft of the United States to actually come in, so that these issues can be, easily petered out in WTO, for example, right? So those issues are there. And one more thing with what Karthike was saying in the last, I mean, see, in terms of how India projects itself as a power, I think in a lot of ways, I mean, yes, we cannot go and do much on the South China Sea, or the Western Pacific, etc., etc. But I think India is also selling itself short in terms of how it actually performs on international forums, etc. I mean, yes, Australia did call out, China, for example, on the global stage, and there was a backlash. But India had an opportunity at WHO to do the same, or at least ask for transparency. And India waited for like 2-3 months, and I think and what could have happened? I mean, we already had a border conflict on. I mean, I really don't see. Some people were like, let's not provoke China. I mean, that's, I think, right now. I mean, that's a train that left the station. So I think in a lot of ways India can actually do more, and it's selling itself short. But yeah, that would need some requirement or help from the other countries as well.
So just to add some points on that, like even in the earlier WTO rounds in Doha or before that, India has always taken this unofficial role of speaking for the lower LDCs, the least developed countries, and speaking about the African countries. And I think the TRIPS waiver was spearheaded by India in support of the people, of these countries. And so these are the things which India does as far as soft power as a responsible power is. And I think it involves more cooperation from Western liberal democracies to actually appreciate this and also take part in this, because the entire TRIPS waiver is actually not going to materialize into a lot of things, because if you remember the remarks of the ambassador Tai, they said two important things: that the admin will work for the raw materials and there will be a text-based negotiation. So these two statements are not actually hinting towards any material things happening on the TRIPS waiver. The first one is to create a hybrid system, sort of, to arrange for raw materials. The third one, text-based negotiation, takes a lot of time, which might even solve the problem of supply chain. There will be no need for IP waiver at that time. So there might be disagreements, but I think this is what my understanding is of this particular TRIPS waiver, how it culminated into this. Now, leaving that aside, I think we are running out of time. So, of course, you can, if anybody wants to counter what I said, it's open. But now I would start with concluding remarks from everyone, and just 2-3 minutes of your concluding remarks, if that's fine. Sure. Whoever wants to, start can begin.
Yeah, look, at a very kernel level, I think, as I mentioned before, and just to kind of not to regurgitate, but just to end where I started, that the India-US relationship is fundamentally um, truly a bipartisan relationship, and I think that equation won't change, irrespective of who comes to power as well. We have seen that even though when he was Chief Minister Modi, he was banned from the United States, but that relationship only grew as when he became Prime Minister Modi, and he dealt the same way they dealt with President Trump, the way he did President Obama. The two very, very different individuals, and because the fundamentals are same, it's no longer just a personality-driven politics the way you see Nixon and Indira Gandhi, and that's because India itself, the India story has changed, right? India has gone from aid to trade. India went from a country that required aid under the PL 480 food subsidies under Lyndon Johnson in the 60s to one where India and the United States can hammer over trade, right? And that is a good, when we spoke about the conundrums of trade, that's a good position to be, right? And one of the reasons why, and inversely proportional, why US and Pakistan relationship have gone from the Dulles Eisenhower era to when Nixon and Yahya Khan were born homie buddies to where it is now is ironically up to a president who visited Pakistan in college, who never visited Pakistan even once during the administration, is because um, not just a strategic fallout, but the fact that Pakistan does not have an economic story that it can speak of. And maybe Islamabad and Beijing have now become closer buddies because of that. So I think that's where I'd leave that. I think soft power is fundamentally that's done more for the US foreign policy than any overarching administration has. I think that India's story of soft power is always going to be there. There is a sense of um, there is a sense of that a sense of cultural efflorescence that India projects on the world stage that will be there. And I think that ties into where India sees itself also on the diplomacy front. That maybe the Vasudeva Kutumbakam may be outdated, but India fundamentally sees the world as one family. I understand that geopolitics and kumbaya moments don't really go hand in hand, but there is that notion where India truly believes that it and sometimes it's come back to bite India, right? We saw that with Nehru and Mao with Panchsheel and Hindi Chuni by that didn't work out in 1962. Modi and G have had influential ties, and we saw with Doklam, we had a reset in Wuhan and Mamlapuram, and then they again came back in Ladakh, Galan Valley. So there is a sense of not missing the forest for the trees in understanding strategic interests. However, I fundamentally see that the one thing I didn't bring up before, and I think it's very important to notice from a Washington perspective, is there is an asymmetry of power between the US and India, right? There is a goodness about relations, but there's also an asymmetry of power. And there is a sense of, while the United States is the Western Hemisphere and far, far on the other side of the world, it is still the center of the geopolitical universe, particularly on Washington, D.C. And I think when you do that, every place is important. And I've always said that sometimes I think US foreign policy is what I call the Crimean acronym, right? And what Crimean for me stands for is China, Russia, Iran, Middle East, Afghanistan, North Korea. Because only when you're a problematic state does Washington spend a lot of time, expertise, and time worrying on it. India is not a problematic state as such for the United States, which means in some ways it's a boring marriage, occasionally spiced by the inconveniences of trade deals and stuff. Which also means that people in Washington don't sit and think about India 24/7 the way we do in India, because again, it's asymmetry of power. It is the popular high school kid that everyone wants to know, everyone wants to have a relation with. But the fact that you can hyphenate US any country in the world, US Brazil, enough literature there, US Russia, enough literature there, US Korea, enough literature there, US Azerbaijan, there's some literature there. You can't do the same with India and many other countries, right? If you do India, Brazil, half the people in Delhi will be scratching their heads. Where do we, BRICS, okay, Dilma Rousseff, okay, but so that behooves on India to really grow on a thing. And in some ways, if at all, you can take a leaf from the China playbook, which I don't recommend because the CCP is problematic. But it is a Deng Xiaoping philosophy of hide your strength, bide your time, which India sort of does, but the strength hasn't really come through. It's biding its time, but the strengths haven't come through. And I think it's only when you kind of move from that aid to trade stories and get done will your gravitas increase. Gravitas doesn't come to those who ask it. Gravitas, it comes when the others see that there is something to that. And I think that the moment that people think about United States doesn't spend all this time thinking about Delhi, or because it's a stable marriage. In some way in diplomacy, India-US relations a AAA bond. Only when India really accentuates its economic prowess, focus on its internal reforms that India needs to do, focus on its own growth structure. We've seen what happened, how India went from vaccine diplomacy to COVID crisis within a few span of weeks. Only then will India really have a sense of increasing its potential, increasing its not just being an addition to G7, but a very important player in, maybe in addition to it. Overall, India is still at the G20. India will still have a seat at the table, but the voice gets amplified when you get the gravitas. So I would say that the way I look at India-US relations right now is for India to look at consolidating on its own strength that it's built on. It's a 30-year economic story. And don't forget, and to be fair to India, people forget that India is not an economic story since 47. India's economic story only since 1991. Because only the reforms in 1991 that really allowed India to grow and develop. And I think the next few years, at least the next decade or so, will be even more paramount to see if India hits its $5 trillion mark or falls short of it. And if it does, it's always going to be an economic, it's an infinite potential of what India can achieve. But the reforms have to start internally. The India-US relations is established, is there to stay. And I think it'll only grow from time to time. And if India can continue on its upward trajectory path, that's where I'll be more sanguine on the relationship as well. So thank you for my time, and it's a pleasure being here.
Yeah, I would basically agree with most of the things that he pointed out. I think one of the things that India and US can focus on is strengthening institutional frameworks within the Quad more, delivering on some of the promises that it has made in the last 1 year. I think that would be great. I think on the defense and security partnership, I think that anybody who follows or has a vague idea about the relationship in general would know that that's already flourishing, and that is to Indians, I think that's the primary goal of the relationship, is to have get some assistance from the United States when it comes to balancing China, and now even more so. And I think the United States of America is actually delivering on that. That started, I think, during the Modi-Obama administration. That was strengthened during the Trump administration. I think Biden will probably continue and actually build it, because I think for the Biden administration, the main thing or the main approach is to build alliances, to rebuild not just America, but actually also build and engage alliances in Asia, which probably they thought the Trump administration did not do very well. Having said that, of course, there will be some minor irritants. I think in India, there is a sense that whenever these kind of debates or hot potato political issues come up, whether it's shared values or what the US says or Canada says or UN says, I think in some ways we always react by thinking as if we have an alternative. Right now, I think a lot of people need to look really hard before suggesting that China did anything to help India during the pandemic, right? A lot of people are very harsh on the United States of America when it came to, a little delay in assistance. But ultimately, see, United States came through. In the recent last week, for example, the Parliament, you saw the Foreign Ministry declare the amount of supplies that came from the United States, not just from the government, but from the citizens as well, right? So I would say that in that sense, a lot of people in India, especially the non-alignment camp, needs to understand that as much as these are irritants are there, and yes, we need to maintain our strategic autonomy. we need the United States as well, right? I mean, this is not like we can, suddenly stop and be like, oh, let's talk to Russia and then we can make friends with China. That's not going to happen. I think that's anybody who thinks that would be naive to, think that. So because I think this is something which I think in last few days somebody said that if India was autocratic, then we have no problem with China. That's really not the case, because we have long-standing issues. We have systematic issues with China. We don't have just border problems with China. I don't think that whole we can go back to the Hindi India China bye bye. That's not going to happen, right? And I think in that sense, the United States is right now the best answer that we have to balance China. And I think the United States also understand. And I think some of the commentators or some in the commentariat also need to understand that, look, you're not, you're not doing a favor to India, and India is not doing a favor to you as well. This is an equal partnership, and I think that is something that we need to focus on. Having said that, I would say though, in the end, because we've seen some commentary and some discussions on social media, although they should be, of course, stay there, I would say, to some extent. But I would say that there is a change in terms of, and some in Washington have to be careful of how they frame issues when it comes to democratic backsliding or problems within the Indian polity. Because yes, bipartisan support is very strong, but as some people point out, that because of problems in India, there will be a higher political cost, or it will be difficult for the administration to lobby in on Capitol Hill for India, etc. Basically saying that, we'll need extra effort to get something done for you. I think people in America should also understand that, ultimately you have to understand the Indian people have fundamentally changed. The Indian polity is going through a churn. Some of it is good, some of it is not so good, right? And they need to not watch themselves. I would say that would be too much, but how you frame certain debates and how you frame certain topics is very essential, because I see a lot of commentators comparing India to China to an absurd extent, blurring the line of the actual differences between India and China. You don't want to do that, because trust me, right now on a lot of topics, the Indian people have shifted. If there is a government change tomorrow, the government cannot just come in and restore Article 370 and everything will be great in Kashmir. India will have problems there. Indian people overall support what's been done in Kashmir. Of course, we have disagreements and we have our issues with how things have, in terms of political prisoners, etc., which of course some in the United States have rightly pointed out. I think, people in the United States have to understand that India is a different country. It's going through a very different phase. We have a lot of outstanding issues, whether it's on our borders or whether it's within our borders. And I think one needs to be careful how you frame that, because remember, in India, there is a big camp on the left, on the right, which actually wants to undermine this relationship, right? So, I mean, I, for one, am a big supporter of the India-US relationship, and I don't want it to be, hijacked, or, I don't want to be, it to become a casualty of these kind of stupid debates, right? Because these will go on, but I think wisdom will prevail, and I think that's what's been happening. And yeah, so yeah, overall trajectory I think is great, and I think as long as we maintain our focus on the material side of it, right? The main threat in the room, which we know, China. As much as India wants to say, this is an inclusive Indo-Pacific, etc., etc., let's be honest, this is primarily about China, whether we call it or not. That's the main point here. So yeah, I would say that that's there, and whatever the commentariat says, it says. I mean, ultimately, we don't want a globe. We want shared values to be emphasized. I think it works for us as well, but I don't think a global crusade or a Puritan test that is always applied to India would actually help the relationship, because I mean, with our own colonial baggage that we had and how we see the West in general, people on the left, people on the right, they're a little skeptical of that. So let's not accentuate those anxieties, and just work on what's been happening. And I think both administrations, the Modi government and the Biden administration, Jaishankar and Secretary Blinken, actually realize that. I think on that front, I think there's a huge amount of convergence, and I think we'll see that in the in the coming visit. So yeah, barring any huge major changes, I don't think we'll see a major departure or a major deviation from the current trend. And I think yeah, and I think Indians should also one last point. I think Indians should also realize that a lot of what happens in Washington is also a byproduct of the huge diaspora we have and different communities, not just Indian diaspora, but across the world. I mean, we look at Australia, for example. You look at, for example, in the UK, right? You'll see a lot of these issues come up, especially with regards to things like Kashmir, right? So I think on that we just need to focus on what we think we are doing good, and also one thing I would say is we don't communicate very well. That I think has to better needs to be better, not by, and that doesn't have that can't happen from the Indian people. That has to happen from the Indian government, right? So how the government reacts to these issues is also very important. So yeah, I would stop there. I would thank Abhivardhan and Kartike, and of course Akshop. It was a great conversation.
So I will be very brief in my conclusion, of course. Um, so, very simple points. As I had stated very early, I believe that value systems are both bottom top and top bottom. They cannot be technocratic by nature. Therefore, policy confrontations, whenever happen, they are allied with value systems whenever necessary, not always. And it is not necessary that the way on value systems it is abruptly or very erroneously or irresponsibly commented. I don't think the policy issues or legal issues even should be dealt in that way. That is why it is important to come out of emotions and all of that stuff to realities. And policy is all about reality. Having said that, there should be two things which should be clear with the Indo-US ties. Number one, the cooperation will go very well. I mean, as Rishabh rightly pointed out on the issues, it will go fairly just fine. And even India and US realize that there is no issue with that. I think one thing which we need to understand is, okay, fine, the cooperation goes ahead. Which are the two aspects which I'm trying to talk about? The first aspect should be that since the cooperation goes ahead, they should be based on real policy issues. And if you want to ally the Indo-Pacific idea, as which is a very normative construct, some people call it. Uh, I would be a little bit harsh, but not intending to be, but just a little bit harsh because people have pointed out this in the past that the Indo-Pacific is a very normative amateur idea, which can develop not just with the anti-China sentiment, but also with other things which are allied to it. For example, I remember that I had a podcast with Sana Hashmi, and she pointed out that the Indo-Pacific should not be just all about anti-China if we are focusing on Taiwan, for example. So it should be like, fine, you have that anti-China issue because you have a Thucydides trap issue as well. Therefore, you need to balance it out. Yes, China confrontation is reality, but it doesn't mean you need to act the same way NATO countries acted with Russia. And look at what the abysmal state is with between Russia and the US. But yeah, fine, there are some problems with Russia, but still there should have been some avenues of cooperation, and yes, there should be. So first things first, let's have an inclusive Indo-Pacific idea. If it is anti-China, that is one part of it, and it can slyly develop. It doesn't need to be too direct. It is up to the countries how they take it up. I believe it will be very sly. It will not be direct because, as we know, that India doesn't want to have a direct diplomatic confrontation with China at all right now, and it won't be intending to have it. The virtue signaling on Tibet when it comes to Dalai Lama also shows this. So the second point, which is I would like to propose, is that I think the Indo-US relations is a very celebratory re- uh, resemblance of how we form a diaspora or how we use experiences when it comes to communities, sectors, as well as diplomats. How? So the United States does not become a world superpower just because of hard power and all of that. Their soft power empire is very important. They focus on universal ideas, that is fine. Some element of universalism was okay, which is generalized, not everything. And that made it a power. Japan also tried to do it with anime. Israel tried to do it with its Jewish community. China tried to do it with also, but China is not successful too much. European Union tried to do it from Audi to Joy to communicating with countries. However, we know that European countries don't ally much with the British in that sense. They have disagreements with the Brits. But we see that some element of, and this is also something which Simon and Holt talks about in his book, The Good Country Equation, that, okay, fine, you want cooperation? Okay. countries should see where they can meaningfully contribute to it. India has shown that. India is a Mr. No or Dr. No, a PhD in being a no sometimes. I'm just joking on that. But I think from a practical perspective, it knows how to contribute to the global governance, even if it has a strategic loss. So, from the Indo-US experience, you want to expand yourself, you want to have multi-alignment, please have it. The alliance system will not work because of the simple reason of the multipolar nature, even if it is US centric. So please go ahead with that. But yeah, in the second conclusion, as I stated, let me go on and I'll complete on that very finally. Is that okay? Fine. You want to go ahead? Let's go for cooperation and strengthen your multi-alignment related assets. Once you do that, a lot is achievable, and then we can see a lot mature development in the Indo-US ties, because both of these powers, India is kind of a minor power according to some people. Both of these powers, on equal aspects of considerations when it comes to policy or shared values, as we call about, can uh, focus on universal values in a much pragmatic way. There are certain pragmatic elements of US foreign policy, not everything. I have severe disagreements with American foreign policy, but there are certain very good aspects of US foreign policy which we can't ignore, even in international law. So I think there we can achieve. So I rest my case, and I think we really had an amazing discussion. I'm thankful to Workshop for accepting our invitation, and I'm also thankful to Rishabh for accepting our invitation, and of course, Karthika, thank you so much for moderating it.
Thank you. Just one line to close. I think with regards to the Quad or the Indo-Pacific, we can say the elephant in the room is the dragon. It's always about China. So yeah.
I agree.
So to conclude, I think it was a rather enlightening discussion, and we touched upon a lot of issues. And to conclude the conference, I would say that the possibilities of Indo-US relations are vast, and there is a big picture and mutual objectives that can provide many points to converge. And there are many areas where India and US can work. For example, preserving the international structure which we have right now, which is being increasingly being controlled by China. We can have cooperation on intelligence, check upon piracy in the international waters, or even in the usage of military in outer space, etc. So I think our common objectives kind of dwarf the minor hiccups we have due to the concerns raised regarding the Indian democracy, etc. And I think with changes on India's domestic front and efficient diplomacy and some understanding on the US part, I think India and US have a long way to go to work for both, for our mutual geostrategic interests. So that's where I end. I like to thank everyone who has joined and the people who are watching this. I hope you had a lovely conference. You got to know a lot of information, and thank you for joining.